Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. What a treat we have today. Our guest today is author John Nichol. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, you are really a New Mexico literary icon. You have many books. What do you have? You've been writing since you were 16, and how many books?
I've probably written about 80 or 90 books, but I've only published 22 of them.
Ah.
Most of the books I write wind up on trunks, and the trunks wind up in my basement.
Well, we're celebrating your newest book, which is the annual Big Arsenic Fishing Contest. We'll get to that in a minute, but I want to put you in some historical context. So you moved to New Mexico in 1969. What brought you here?
I was living in New York City. I run out of money. I didn't have any place that I could really work. We had a very small apartment. I wanted to get out of New York City, and I had been to Taos in 1957 when I was 16 years old. And I worked for a couple of weeks there for the brother of a farmer I worked with in Virginia. And I really liked Taos. I liked the fact that everybody in 1957 spoke Spanish. And I helped this friend of mine mud his, like an enjarradora, mud plaster his home. And then I went down south and I worked at the Southwest Research Station for the Museum of Natural History in Portal, Arizona. And I wound up fighting forest fires in the Chiricahua Mountains. And all the people I fought fires with were either local Chicanos from Rodeo, New Mexico, or they were Mexican nationals. And I never had so much fun in my life. I mean, it was really cool to be up in the mountains with those guys fighting fires.
Now, tell me a little about your background, because you were raised multilingual, weren't you? Your mom was French?
My mom was French. She died in 1942 when I was only 2 years old. Yeah. But I do have a lot of family over in Europe, in France. My mother was from northern France, from a little town called Port-Blanc in Brittany. And however, she lived in Barcelona, Spain for many years because my grandfather, I think he worked for Gulf Oil in Barcelona. So my mom spoke Spanish, she spoke French, she spoke English, she spoke German, she spoke Italian. And even though she died when I was very young, my dad spoke several languages. He spoke French and English and Russian and some Chinese. So yeah, I was brought up in basically a multilingual, multicultural family. And for much of my life, even though I didn't know my mother, I was kind of fascinated by her French and her Spanish background.
So when you came here, you already had the language, except not its quite delicious New Mexico flavor.
When I came here, yeah, I had spent a year after I got out of college living in Barcelona with my abuelita there, writing what turned out to be the first novel I published called The Sterile Cuckoo.
Yes, which
and then I came to New York City and I hung out a lot with Argentine guys at an empanada stand on McDougal Street because I lived right in Greenwich Village. So I spent a lot of time talking Castilian Spanish, and then I spent a lot of time talking Argentine Spanish. So by the time I came to New Mexico, yeah, I was puro analfabeto, pero por lo menos yo podía hablar en español.
Well, you came here and you have contributed really one of the foundational books of the beloved history of New Mexico literature. You are the author of the Milagro Beanfield War.
Yeah.
And let me show you this exquisite first edition. This is what the first edition looked like.
It's a lovely first edition, and the picture on the cover and the drawings inside the book were done by a wonderful Taos artist named Renee Templeton. And I noticed coming here today that there are some paintings on the wall in the hallway here in the Capitol building done by John Dupuis, who was Renee's husband when I first met her in Taos.
So this is a trilogy, starting with Milagro Beanfield War, then The Magic Journey, which you say is your favorite of your books. Is that still true?
Yeah, it's got everything. The Milagro Beanfield War is written with an awful lot of humor in it, right? And it's kind of, at the heart of it, it's sort of about cultural genocide and that kind of thing. It's a very serious book about culture and people under attack. But it's so humorous that often people come up to me and say, John, your book is so funny. I just laughed myself to death, And I said, people can get the wrong impression. Poverty is no fun. And being under the gun, like the culture and the people of northern New Mexico have been for so long, is not that much fun. So in The Magic Journey, I said, I'm going to make it real clear, what's happening and what it's like to be under that kind of a gun, with an economic system that has enormous inequalities in it, et cetera, et cetera. So The Magic Journey is, I think, sort of a macroscopic overview of how climax capitalism works in the second half of the 20th century.
Well, the third book of the trilogy, and they really should all be read, is called The Nirvana Blues.
Yeah.
So I was going to talk about...
It's my satirical idea of, what's going to happen with the future, and it sort of has happened.
You talk a lot about what happens to a place. As a place... these are about a fictional place called Chamisaville County, but we know it's northern New Mexico, and it's about water, land, race, ethnicity, history, and how they all mix in. But what is your experience that when a small, very unique, characteristic place becomes popular by the rest of the culture, what is gained and what is lost? And would you use Taos as an example, or should we stick to the abstract? Talk about what happened in Chamisaville.
What happened in Chamisaville is what happened all over the planet. There's nothing different that's happened in New Mexico that hasn't happened in New York City, rural Louisiana, in Paris, France, Bulgaria, or any other country on the planet. When I came to New Mexico, there were about 3,500,000,000 people on Earth. Now there are 7,500,000,000 people on Earth. The entire planet has changed. Northern New Mexico is connected to basically everywhere else on Earth. Most of the goods that you buy in Walmart or Smith's or anything like that have been produced all over the place. So that I remember the environmentalist John Muir once said, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And Taos is that way. You could say that New Mexico started to get ruined when, Kearney, marched into Santa Fe and the governor of Santa Fe fled, south. And the Americans took over from the Mexicans, Or you could say it got ruined when the Spaniards, came, or the French came to Mexico and tried to conquer it, yada, yada, yada. And, or you could say that Taos began to get wrecked when the famous cart broke a wheel, for the first artists in the early part of the century. You could say it got ruined after World War II because so many people left town to get jobs, in the war industry. And when they returned to places like Taos, they basically had transformed into a cash economy that ended the sustainable kind of farming, And when I came to Taos in 1969, everybody thought that Taos was just being destroyed completely by the influx of countercultural people that were building
the
communes and stuff like that. And when I got to Taos in 1969, I thought it was Nirvana. There were no houses on the mesa. There were between Ranchos and Taos proper. There were no buildings or anything like that. And land was real cheap and stuff like that. But for people who had lived there for 400 years, 1969 was a disaster.
So was anything gained in this transition?
Lots of things have been, the transition, there's a saying in Spanish, todo el tiempo pasado fue mejor. The past was always better.
Mm-hmm.
But, the past in northern New Mexico, nobody had antibiotics. One of the major diseases in the little towns in the north was malaria, And there was, people say that during the Depression, people didn't suffer as much because they were sustainable farmers, right? They didn't need money. But past times were not so great. At the turn of the 20th century, in 1900, the life expectancy of somebody in this country was 40 years. Now it's, 78, 76, something like that. And so you always get the good with the bad, and I'm not sure how to go into all of that,
Well,
in 5 minutes.
Well, I want to go on to your nonfiction books, just a little bit. Then we're going to talk about the new book.
Yeah.
But you have written these beautiful books. There was a trilogy, starting with one called If Mountains Die.
With photographs by Bill Davis.
Right,
Yeah.
and the text by you.
Yeah.
The second part of it is, I love this title, The Last Beautiful Days of Autumn.
That's this year. We've had an incredible autumn this year.
And the third one on the Mesa we don't have. There's another one. Again, I just love these titles. And the book is so beautiful. A Fragile Beauty, John Nichols' Milagro Country. So thank you for catching this beautiful part of the past.
Yes.
I hope it will be more timeless. So one of the reasons you became so famous is Robert Redford made the Milagro Beanfield War into a film. And what was that process like for you?
It was the biggest nightmare of my life, frankly. It's, I originally gave the option to a man named Moctezuma Esparza, who had no power in Hollywood. As far as I know, he'd only made one film about a weaver in Medinales, New Mexico, named Aguila Martinez. It's a wonderful documentary. And I wanted him to have the option, not Robert Redford, and not Cheech Marin wanted the option, etc., because I wanted it to be a small picture, small movie. We got a grant from the National Endowment of the Humanities to make a $500,000 picture for PBS, right? And then eventually Esparza signed a joint venture agreement with Robert Redford, and Redford eventually decided to direct the film. And when Redford came to New Mexico, I mean, he was like the 800-pound gorilla in the room. He was so famous. And every day, every newspaper in the state would say, Robert Redford's movie crew is throwing their gum wrappers in Truchas Creek, polluting the river while making John Nichols' novel, The Milagro Beanfield War. And I lost all my autonomy. All the political friends that I'd had for 15 or 20 years started coming up to me and saying, "You've sold out. You must be a billionaire now that you're hanging out with Redford. We need money for this. We need money for that, yada, yada." And I found it just incredibly intrusive. And the tension and the stress of dealing with the publicity almost killed me. And when it was over, I was so grateful. And also, Redford was incredible. The movie was incredibly disorganized, and they started filming with only one actor under contract, right?
Who's that, Reuben?
I don't know who was under contract, only one actor under contract. And it was just a confusion that just seemed to accelerate every day. And the movie went way behind schedule. I remember they wrapped it up in 1986. The minute they left Truchas, I think the people of Truchas just burned the sets, right? And then they realized that they needed more footage, so they had to come back to Truchas the next year, right? Rebuild the set, shoot some more film and stuff like that. And nobody ever showed me rushes. I didn't know whether it was going to be a good movie, a bad movie, a patronizing movie, or whatever. And so for me, it was an enormous agony. And in the end, I think it's a loving movie. It's not, viciously violent. It's humorous, that kind of thing. If Moctezuma Esparza had made the $500,000 film for PBS, I think it might have used a lot more northern New Mexicans, etc. But, finally it was okay, but I was so happy when it ended, And it took me a few years to just recover my relationship with all the friends I'd had in Taos and make them realize, that I was not a billionaire that lived in a protected community with machine guns on either side of the door to keep out the hoi polloi.
We're speaking today with John Nichols about the process of making his wonderful book, The Milagro Beanfield War, into a film by Robert Redford. You had other experience with films. You did The Wizard of Loneliness was made from one of your books, The Sterile Cuckoo.
3 of my novels have been made into film.
Yeah.
The Sterile Cuckoo by Alan Pakula, The Wizard of Loneliness starred Lucas Haas and Leah Thompson, and The Milagro Beanfield War. And I also wound up working on films in Hollywood for almost 18 years. I got an accidental career when I was asked to write a picture called Missing for the Greek director Costa Gavras, and it got 4 Academy Award nominations, and it won for the Best Adapted Screenplay. And so people kept calling me up and saying, are you available, John, to write this picture or that picture? And mostly it was, if Hollywood was trying to make a communist picture, right, they said, call John Nichols.
On the hotline.
And if it was a European director, they would say, call John Nichols, because he speaks French, he speaks Spanish, he speaks English, right? So I worked with Louis Malle, I worked with Costa Gavras on 3 films, I worked with Carol Rice on a film, and I worked with Ridley Scott on a couple of films. So it was fun, but I didn't have to do it,
Yeah.
So I picked and chose.
So your new book, the annual Big Arsenic Fishing Contest, is so wonderful and so funny. I want to know how you came to be a fisherman, and what did your grandfather do? He was an ichthyologist.
My grandfather
right?
was an ichthyologist.
Same name as you, right?
Yeah, John Treadwell Nichols. My name is John Treadwell Nichols II. My grandfather, for about 40 years or 45 years, was the curator of recent fishes at the American Museum of Natural History in New York.
Recent fishes?
It's called Recent Fishes. He was the chief ichthyologist at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And but he did not teach me how to fish, believe me. He collected fish for the museum, right? I learned how to fish when I came to Taos, and I remember starting with salmon eggs on the Red River in the middle of winter, trying to learn how to catch hatchery trout. And eventually I became a fly fisherman and loved fishing, in particular the Rio Grande River.
Well, in this book, you started out saying about the relationship of the truth. If you want to know the truth, you've got to make it up.
Sure.
And the great fishing tales, the one that got away, and how fishing and fiction are really a sort of liar's poker.
Sure.
And then you take us into this wonderful adventure of yourself and your 2 best friends, and this contest that you had for 20 years. It is funny. It is a tragedy also. And I was wondering if you could just read us a little excerpt from
Sure.
it, if you've...
All right.
Yeah.
What people don't, people ask me to read, and I will read sections of the book, and there's no fishing in any of the sections
That's
that I
okay.
read.
We want the humor and the joy, the
So
vitality.
there are 3 characters. There's a narrator who has no name. There's a character named Yuri Stone, who's 5'3" tall. He grew up in a card-carrying communist family in Philadelphia in the Strawberry Mansion ghetto. He talks tough. Then there's Bubba Baxter, who is an archetypical Texas roustabout, very, very noisy, who played starting nose guard in the Southwest football conference with SMU in Texas, etc. All 3 of them are very obnoxious. And the way they communicate is by insulting each other. And the book is really a love story
Yeah.
between these three guys. So this is just a short riff from after their first day, their first contest fishing on the Rio Grande. All three of these guys are writers. The narrator is a writer who's worked in movies, he's published novels, yada, yada, yada. The Yuri Stone is a writer who spends his whole life trying to write a great masterpiece. He never publishes anything. The Texan, Bubba Baxter, winds up publishing a book called The Obnoxious Nose Guard that becomes a bestseller and made into a movie. But anyway, here's after the first contest. On our way north in my truck along the paved Wild River access road that ran beside the edge of the canyon, we drank beer and we consumed potato chips. We were numbed by fatigue, but we felt good. It's called the ecstasy of exhaustion. A few kangaroo rats zipped across the narrow road. 2 deer on the shoulder froze as we cruised by. Popping open our second beers, we began discussing Ernest Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald like college freshmen in a PX drinking coffee and munching on cinnamon crullers. Then Yuri complained about the novel he'd been working on unsuccessfully for years. I told him, "Maybe you're trying too hard." Yuri snapped back at me, "Maybe you're not trying hard enough in your literature." I said, "You're too finicky." That's not the first time I told him. I said, "You type it clean now. Just send it off, move on." That punched his button. And when you punched Yuri's button, you received an earful. I'll try to recreate the gist of his tirade, because 1, it gives you an idea of the real Yuri, and 2, because it sets the tone for my story to follow, which, you may be happy to note, is not just about catching trout on the Rio Grande. "Wait a minute, you condescending popinjay," Yuri said to me. "You don't know anything about real literature. I'm not interested in blamming out a bunch of second-rate novels for little old ladies wearing suppos to read in their Scarsdale gazebos after tea on Sunday afternoons. I am a serious person and a serious writer. My roots ain't Damon Runyon, Max Schulman, and that Armenian lightweight you love so much, what's his name, Billy Saroyan. I've read Joyce and Hugo and George Eliot and Germinal by Émile Zola and Gide and Malraux and Camus. I'm sorry, but I've read Les Miserables, every stinking word of it, and I've read Anna Karenina twice and the Brothers Karamazov and War and Peace. I'm not saying that to pretend I'm some kind of elite pansy with a phony aristocrat accent pasting up the Paris Review in George Plimpton's silk stocking Manhattan apartment either. I took those books seriously. Who gives a fig for Jay Gatsby with all his pretty shirts, or the old man in the sea carrying his stupid sail spar like a blinking neon sign cross? Spare me, please. I'm interested in the Grand Inquisitor and Jean Valjean and Flaubert. I said Flaubert. In my own work, I strive to say something about the human condition that isn't mere lightweight tripe like what's his name, your other hero, Harold Robbins. I want to be like Proust. I admire Romain Rolland. I care about what I'm doing and the language I'm doing it in, even if it takes me forever to create it. You understand? Novels that count aren't sired in a day by jackasses like you who spend all their hours pestering their agents and their editors for the royalty figures while they're negotiating film points and sitting at the throne table at Ma Maison. You tell me this if you can. What's the point of creating anything less than a masterpiece?
Yes, yes. Thank you, thank you. You know, what I love, because this is a laugh-out-loud book, and again, the tragicomedy. You had said that it's humor that makes mortality palpable, and that all of your stories touch on mortality. They do indeed. You say, comedy is how I survived the slaughterhouse. Laughter is the best medicine. And New Mexico, you said this, has the best sense of humor in North America.
Yes, and we're really going to need it now.
Well, and you also say that your life is like a jigsaw puzzle, and all of these books that you've done, the published and the unpublished, are fitting in pieces in the overall puzzle and pattern of your life.
People always ask, say, what book do you like the best, or they say, you wrote the Milagro Beanfield War, the Magic Journey, the Nirvana Blues, and but you haven't created anything that big or that panoramic
the famous
since.
masterpiece that,
And,
I don't know.
And, my answer to that is, your whole life, I think any writer, you're working on an overall macroscopic vision of the planet, And my vision isn't just the Milagro Beanfield War. It's not just the annual Big Arsenic Fishing Contest or, the Nirvana Blues. I mean, ultimately, when I die, I will have filled in as much of my vision as I can. And every book I've written is a part of the vision, And some books are real political. Some books aren't political at all. I have a book coming out in March called My Heart Belongs to Nature. And it's basically a book that's just about my relationship to the natural world. And it has like 110 photographs only of the natural world that I've just taken in Taos County. And then the book that I've just finished a draft of, I've been working on for 30 years, is it's like a memoir of my mother and father. And my mom died when I was 2. And when I was sort of 60 years old, I said, I would really like to know that woman because she'd been whitewashed out of my life. And so I've written so far about 90 drafts of that book, and I finally think I have something. But all these books together just comprise, sort of one book in the end, which is basically
your life.
The life that I've led or whatever, and my macroscopic overview of the world as it is.
I am so happy that your life, as you've led it, has led you here today to spend some time with us. I'm very, very grateful. Our guest today is John Nichols. You probably know him for the Milagro Beanfield War. His latest, which is an absolutely delightful read, the annual Big Arsenic Fishing Contest.
Yes, if you only read one book this year,
Yeah.
let it be the annual
Yeah.
Big Arsenic Fishing Contest.
And let yourself have a good laugh.
Please.
John, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lorene.
And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.